previous video, we proved that none of Koch's postulates have been followed to identify COVID-19, which alone, in my opinion, is criminally negligent of the so-called authorities who think they have the authority to lock people in their houses. Thank God for LondonReal.tv, who established an independent platform that is censorship free. I highly recommend that you go there and look for the search microscope icon in the top right corner and type the word Ike, and you can watch the second interview in full. It's called Rose Ike 2, the coronavirus conspiracy, how COVID-19 will seize your rights and destroy our economy. On that video, Rose Ike 2, you will also see where the inventor of the tests the world is using to diagnose COVID-19 has specified that this type of test should not be used for infectious diseases. So we have proved that the correct test has not been followed to identify any virus, and now the actual tests being used are not supposed to be used to diagnose infectious diseases. Moving forward with my evidence, I want to draw your attention to something that we all have in our bodies, which is called exosomes. When you understand what they are and how they look compared to what governments and the media are calling COVID-19, I think you're going to be amazed. But first I want to give you more in-depth information, so let's listen to this.
So then we come to something else that Andrew Kaufman identified, which was a tremendous piece of observation and research. You can see it in his video on davidicke.com when this is over. What happens when a cell gets poisoned is it secretes something called exosomes. This is part of the natural, everyday immune system response to poison cells. And these exosomes, as they are released, and they're only released when the cell is poisoned, and it can be poisoned through many, many reasons. It can be toxicity. Wait for this one. It can be poison through stress and fear. You imagine the stress and fear that's going on in the world now during this lockdown. It can be caused by disease, infection, and it can be caused by electromagnetic fields, which will become very relevant when we get into 5G. So these exosomes are released, and one of the roles of exosomes is poison cells warning other cells as they travel around, there's a problem. Get ready, look, there's a problem here. So all you have to do to get exosomes released is to have poison cells by these various reasons. What Kaufman started looking at was under the microscope pictures of exosomes, what they look like. And then he looked at an under the microscope picture of what is claimed to be COVID-19. These two were exactly the same. He then starts looking at the genetic makeup of the exosomes, which you will find in the lung fluid of people who have problems with the lungs, because the problems are generating the release of exosomes. And he looked at the genetic makeup claimed for COVID-19. They are exactly the same in every relevant way. An exosome and so-called COVID-19 even lock into the same cell receptors as each other. They are as Kaufman has clearly shown, the same thing. So what's gone on here is they've taken a natural response mechanism of the body, immune system, to poisonous cells, and they've renamed it COVID-19. Now, this genetic material they've taken from the lungs of people, and what is the basis of this test, will contain, by its very nature, these exosomes. So they're finding a natural human immune system response mechanism, this secretion from poison cells, and they're calling it COVID-19. And because anyone who has any level of cellular toxicity is going to produce these exosomes, then the potential for positive tests, yes, COVID-19, it's a pandemic, is endless.
Okay, so now I'm going to show you a shortened clip of the Andrew Kaufman video showing us under the microscope what an exosome looks like and how it's identical to what they say COVID-19 is. As I said, it's a shortened video of what I showed you in the presentation on Koch's postulates. So don't immediately think you've seen this before, because when you saw that, you might not be necessarily looking for what an exosome is, which is why I want to play you the shortened version again now.
But so how can they say that, it's like that virus with such a low identity between the sequences? And, then they claim to have isolated viral particles and show them under the microscope. But if you once again look at the procedures, they're mixing this with other things, especially foreign mammal cells and antibiotics, which creates exosome particles, which look just like viral particles under a microscope. But then they don't account for those viral particles when they show the microscope images. So, what exactly are they showing? It's unclear, because they have, once again, an impure sample with different types of particles, and they make no account of this. So essentially what I've been able to reason from looking at these experiments is that there's really no proof that they've isolated anything that would be consistent with their definition of a virus. And they certainly haven't come close to showing any causal relationship between any new disease. And if you look more broadly at the data on mortality and such, you'll see that there's really no evidence of a new disease either.
Okay, now I'd like to educate you more by playing you this 8-minute presentation on exosomes. So let's dive straight into that.
Do you have an open mind? Can you suspend judgment for a moment? Most people can't. But what if your job depends on it? What if the freedom to hug people depends on it? What if your life depends on it? Here's a new theory. First, consider that we live in a world where everything is toxic. The soil, the water, the air, our food, even our medicines are toxic. Even stress can be toxic. Now imagine that all these toxins are poisonous to us on a cellular level. Imagine that our cells have a defense and respond to this situation. Poisoned genetic material, either RNA or DNA, is packaged up and sent out of the cell in tiny balls of protein. Let's call these balls of genetic material exosomes. Let's imagine that exosomes can act as messages to alert other cells of a particular poison, and so all throughout the body, more and more cells package up the poisoned material and release it. Also, at certain times of the year due to temperature cycles, humans tend to purge a high number of these poisoned genetic materials out of the body, resulting in symptoms of illness. These exosomes neither cause illness nor are they infectious, though they do appear to spread throughout the body. Now, that's exosome theory. Let's move on to the established theory of viruses. Viruses are generally regarded as not alive. They have no cellular structure and do not reproduce on their own. though we do have trillions of them inside our bodies. They are tiny bits of genetic material, either RNA or DNA, packaged in tiny protein balls that appear to exit and enter cells. Sound familiar? We believe that some of these entities are infectious and pathogenic, transmitting amongst humans and reproducing inside our bodies, causing illness and death. So let's look at the situation for this coronavirus and compare what is happening to these two theories. Let's first consider the origin story of the coronavirus. A group of people had respiratory illness unresolved by antibiotics, so medical officials began looking, of course, for a virus. What they eventually found under the electron microscope were small protein balls being excreted by the cell. Okay, first comparison. This would make sense in both exosome theory and virus theory. Then they searched for and found an RNA fragment that they had not seen before in some of these patients. This would make sense in both exosome theory and virus theory. Now, they did not prove that they could infect somebody or an animal with a purified form of this so-called virus. They simply assumed that this RNA fragment was the cause of the illness they saw in some patients, and they assumed it was contagious. So do you know how the tests work? It's not a binary test, like a pregnancy test. It's called a PCR test, and it involves amplifying genetic material by doubling it in dozens of cycles until you have billions or trillions of the original molecules, and then using those results to determine if you have enough of the identified RNA fragment to be considered positive. Here's the thing. At a certain point of amplification, every single person would test positive. They use an arbitrary cutoff point where they stop doubling the material. That cutoff point is different amongst different tests for COVID-19. In fact, there were 10 different cutoff points amongst the 33 tests approved by the FDA. Seems a little strange, right? You might find it interesting that the Nobel Prize-winning inventor of the test did not believe it should be used to diagnose infectious illness. And perhaps you've heard about some of the problems with the test, such as the high rate of false positives. But in any case, let's say that after 37 times of doubling a specific genetic material they found in your body, they determine that you have enough of the RNA they are looking for to be considered positive. This could make sense in both exosome theory and virus theory. But clearly there are clusters of people getting ill. Look at New York City. It must be a virus. However, if you are being poisoned by something in your environment, it's likely people near you are too. And if we commonly purge these poisons during specific times of the year, many people may have symptoms of illness all at once. This fits either theory. Now, here's where things get interesting. Let's go to the Diamond Princess cruise ship situation. Did you know that people who were bunked together for days had conflicting positive and negative tests? How could one person have this highly infectious illness but not transmit it to somebody bunking with them for days? This would make sense in exosome theory, where the balls of RNA are not contagious, but it would not make sense for virus theory, where the balls of RNA are supposed to be highly infectious. Let's take a look at the first case of transmission in Illinois. A woman traveled to Wuhan, came back, and both she and her chronically ill husband ended up testing positive. Medical authorities then tracked over 300 people who had had close contact with them to see who acquired the virus. And guess what? 0 positives. This again would make sense in exosome theory, since exosomes are not contagious. But it would not make sense for virus theory, where this is supposed to be an infectious virus. In fact, do you know that there are many documented cases all around the world of patients testing positive for this RNA fragment with no relevant travel history and no known possible contact with somebody who was infected? These were people in the middle of nowhere, early on in this whole crisis who suddenly were testing positive. This would make sense, again, in exosome theory, where the RNA is being produced as an immune response within our cells. But it would not make sense for virus theory, where you are supposed to have had contact with somebody with the virus. What about the high levels of people testing positive who don't get sick? In fact, 80% of people testing positive are either asymptomatic or have slight cold symptoms. Why? This would make sense in exosome theory, since the RNA fragments are not the cause of the illness. But it would not make sense for virus theory, where this virus is supposed to cause the illness. Things get even stranger. Did you know that some people go from testing positive to testing negative to testing positive again in a matter of days? And that would make sense for exosome theory, where perhaps the cells are simply releasing more or less of these exosomes depending on certain conditions. But it doesn't make sense in virus theory, where you are supposedly infected until you have rid yourself of the virus. So which of these theories seems more likely to you? What if you heard that there are virologists who believe that viruses are actually exosomes? What if I told you that doctors and other scientific experts also believe this? Ultimately, regardless of which theory you believe in at this point, the established infectious virus theory or the emerging theory of exosomes, how confident are you in the PCR test? Are you really interested in having your life hinge on the results you get from this potentially meaningless test? Do you want your loved ones tested? Do you want to be tested? Or shall we perhaps refuse the test?
Before I end this video, may I remind you of the phrase cognitive dissonance. You've been presented with 3 incontrovertible points. COVID-19 has never been properly identified. The test used is not for infectious diseases. And what is being identified using those tests is more than likely exosomes. So I suggest that you are now beginning to suffer cognitive dissonance. You are saying, but people are dying. Don't you think our governments know what you've presented here? 2 valid points. People are dying, and later I will show you what it is they are dying from. As for whether your Prime Minister or President, with all their resources already knowing this, I'll present you with evidence to allow you to decide for yourself on that matter. What is now answered, however, is that global lockdowns were completely unnecessary. In the next video, I will show you where the thing that is killing people came from and why they want to keep it so quiet. I'll see you there.